Nothing Without Honor, written by Martin Hicks, narrated by Ronald Bruce Meyer. Prologue. The foul weather had set in on the Monday as the CSS Palmetto continued her southward passage through the China Sea, and the month of March drew towards its close. It began with what for more than a day had been a brisk but helpful east-southeasterly wind, though one which had gradually freshened as the sky and sea had yellowed, whipping the waves into increasing turbulence. White-capped rollers grew in size, becoming stormy seas, which began to lash their spray caps over the bulwarks and across the deck, continuing to grow in size and force until ever greater volumes of darker water washed inboard, to froth and foam around the hatches, guns, and deck fittings, before sluicing out through the scuppers. The worsening conditions prompted Thomas Grover, the Palmetto's captain, to order the routine foul-weather precautions: extra lashings on the ship's guns and boats, the battening down of the hatches and the rigging of lifelines, the latter measure assisting the on-watch men as far as was possible in getting around the ship with some degree of safety. Secured though the ship was, a proportion of the sea-water that swept the decks with every wave still managed to seep through the oakum deck caulking, as well as finding its way through the various hatches to drip or sometimes trickle down from deck to deck, causing the pumps to be brought into action to keep the water level in the ship's bilges to an acceptable level. As the weather had continued to worsen, the sails had been successively taken in, the topgallants and topmast jibs first, since, being the furthest from the deck, they imposed the greatest strain on the masts in storm-force winds. Before long, however, the topsails too were being reefed by means of their Cunningham apparatus, which reeled them in like window blinds, without men being required to go aloft to take in the heavy canvas by hand. With the wind still increasing, the forejib was next to be dispensed with, along with the drivers on the fore and mainmasts. This left only the mizzen driver, reefed to be sure, but kept aloft, along with those reefed topsails, to provide steerage way for the ship without recourse to the engine. Deck watches were now cut to a minimum as conditions there grew ever more hazardous, with only the helmsman, the officer and master's mate of the watch, and a boatswain's mate with a small detail of hands still on duty there. Grover, too, mindful of the great storm that had been encountered after negotiating Cape Horn the previous fall and the damage that it had inflicted on the ship, spent much of his own time on deck, alternating watches with Adam Matthews, his first officer, as the Palmetto endured the bad weather. With the sea driven by the southeasterly wind, the port side of the ship was most forcibly swept by the waves, and the helmsmen were, as a routine precaution, lashed in their places at the wheel, though Grover had them relieved every hour, allowing them to go below, change their sodden clothing, and dry and warm themselves. Miserable though deck conditions were, he remained impressed with the ship herself. Palmetto's appearance had repeatedly been admired, her lines being regularly compared to those of a clipper, for her hull was indeed long and slender in proportion to her beam, giving an elegance to her appearance uncommon in a ship of war. She rode the conditions like a thoroughbred, lifting her bow, if not always her stern, through the following side of each wave before ploughing into the next sea, as though disdainful of the element's efforts to overcome her. Grover had been beguiled by her on first coming aboard, just over a year ago now, on the River Clyde in Scotland, and had never lost his infatuation with her looks and sailing qualities. She had her faults, to be sure, particularly that tendency to wallow aft in following seas, but to her captain at least such things were minor, small blemishes on the cherished features of a favorite, and insignificant when compared to her many virtues. Having begun her career as a Royal Navy transport, she had, as a result of a change in British Admiralty policy, after a single trip to the Australias, been declared surplus to requirements that had been assessed, in the initial weeks of the previous year, for Confederate service. Commander James Dunwoody Bullock, who oversaw the Southern Confederacy's naval procurement in Great Britain, had an eye for suitable craft, and so it was with this ship. Perhaps, it had been speculated, a vessel which had not been designed as a warship might prove unsuitable for mounting the heavy guns required for modern naval service, but Bullock had assessed the ship better than those who entertained such doubts. Though her hull and decks were indeed of teak, her framing and scantlings were of iron, which increased the rigidity of her hull to the standard required for gunnery, even on a ship whose proportioning spoke of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?